At the study's conclusion, only 74 of the original 600 men were still alive.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at the most horrific experiments done in the name of science.
Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. He wanted to improve the stock of the Aryan race.
The Aversion Project.
Levine made numerous TV appearances, but in public he said little about his trademark therapy.
Targeting a group of people for something beyond their control is cruel enough. Subjecting them to torture under the guise of fixing them is even more insidious. The Aversion Project in South Africa had one goal, quote-unquote, curing people of being gay. For nearly 20 years, countless victims were put through increasingly painful electroshock therapy. When that didn't work, they moved on to more extreme tactics, like chemical castration and even surgery. Hundreds were forcibly operated on, with many surgeries left incomplete by the time the project ended in 1989. The horrific experiment left lasting psychological scars on the victims, many of whom ultimately took their own lives. In 2014, Aubrey Levin, the man behind the project, was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
I would almost call him psychopathic. He has no sense of other people's humanity. He was this person with a huge amount of power, and he did what he wanted with it.
Henrietta Lacks. While medical breakthroughs benefit many, they sometimes come at the expense of a few, or in this case, just one person. Henrietta Lacks was only 31 when she passed from cervical cancer, but her cells lived on, without her or her family knowing. Before she died, 2 samples were taken without her consent, and it was discovered that her cells were able to survive for long periods.
Because there had been this enormous effort to grow cells outside the body for 100 years, because we really didn't know a lot about cells at that point. And in response to all of his colleagues asking for them, George Guy sent them to anyone who wanted to use them for research. And they spread around the world this way really fast.
Since then, scientists have used them to make several important discoveries about cancer. This, however, led to her family's medical records being leaked and relatives harassed for blood samples. It wasn't until 2023, over 70 years later, that her family received compensation.
Her family sued multi-billion-dollar Thermo Fisher Scientific in 2021, saying the company, quote, made staggering profits by using the HeLa cell line, although it, quote, has known that HeLa cells were stolen from Ms. Lacks.
To this day, Lacks's cells and the ethical debate around using them still live on. Feeding children radioactive oatmeal.
What hot breakfast is as easy and fast to prepare as Quaker oats?
Some researchers will go to any length to get the results they need, including targeting vulnerable populations. Walter E. Fernald Developmental Center was originally established to care for children with developmental disabilities, but instead they subjected them to secret tests. Between 1946 and 1953, the center fed dozens of boys with oatmeal laced with radioactive elements, in an experiment sponsored by Quaker Oats.
That's why your family gets that wonderful stick-to-the-ribs feeling with Quaker Oats, that wonderful feeling of well-being.
These children were misled into thinking they were part of a science club and were given incentives to encourage their participation. However, neither them nor their families knew the true extent of the trials. While the radiation doses were low, the unethical use of children who were already at a disadvantage was condemned, and the victims finally received justice in 1998. Kamar. The Cold War may have spurred advancements in various scientific fields, but some of that research was more insidious in nature. Prisoners in Soviet gulags were subject to extreme suffering, with some being sent to Kamar, a lab dedicated to testing poisons.
These were prisoners who had been declared enemies of the people and so were considered expendable.
Established in 1921, the facility exposed countless victims to various lethal substances like mustard gas, ricin, and cyanide.
It was in the late 30s or 40s that the poison program would really flourish. That was the era of a Soviet biochemist named Gregory Myronovsky, a man who developed poisons and tested them out on hundreds, if not thousands of people.
Some of them were given a deadly cocktail that killed them within 15 minutes. Despite these horrors, those responsible were never brought to justice, even after the Soviet Union dissolved and the lab was shut down. There are claims that Kamar was reopened a few years later, meaning these horrific tests could still be occurring today. Human Vivisections of Herophilos. Human experimentation has been a part of medicine since its very inception. As an early pioneer of human anatomy, Herophilos made several discoveries about the brain, eye, and the vascular system that are still supported by scientists today. However, these breakthroughs may have been achieved through unethical and violent means. Some have alleged that he would vivisect convicted criminals live with the help of his associate Erasistratus, a method that was seen as controversial even back then. It is believed that hundreds of unwilling participants were subjected to Herophilos' dissections. Although his work has been undoubtedly vital to modern anatomical research, knowing how he went about it casts his accomplishments in a much darker light. Dr. Leo Stanley's San Quentin prison experiments. Chief surgeon at San Quentin, Dr. Leo Stanley used prisoners for various experiments from 1913 to 1951, some verging into dark territory. These experiments included sterilization and possibly finding treatments for Spanish flu. A strong supporter of eugenics, Stanley performed vasectomies on inmates who were sold on the idea of better health, reformed behavior, and a stronger sex drive. In one project that aimed to find a source of, quote, rejuvenation, Stanley used live prisoners for surgery that transplanted testicles, human or otherwise. The experiment began with testicles sourced from executed prisoners, but when the supply ran dry, Dr. Stanley began using boar and goat testes in his work. Puerto Rico birth control pill trials.
In 1956, contraceptive pills 20 times as strong as the ones used today were first tested among Puerto Rican women who lived in government housing projects.
Birth control is still relatively new and as such is far from perfect. Before it could be marketed to the population, it first had to be tested, leading to one of the biggest controversies in recent medical history. In the 1950s, trials began in Puerto Rico, targeting impoverished, often undereducated women. They were given the contraceptives without being informed of potential side effects, resulting in several participants being caught off guard.
Y cogí el pote de las pastillas y me tomé una y no había echado nada al estómago. Entonces, pues ahí cuando me tomé la pastilla, pues sentí que se me fue el mundo y se me puso la vista como que se me oscureció.
The symptoms ranged from vomiting to menstrual irregularities, with some even being hospitalized. Their concerns were ignored for the sake of the study, causing the deaths of 3 people. Despite all of the negative responses, the pill was still approved, and those side effects still affect women to this day. The Boston Project. Working with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1953 to 1957, Dr. William Sweet, who was the chief neurosurgeon at Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital, gave uranium injections to 11 cancer patients.
And it turned out to be even more lethal than I realized.
These individuals were already terminally ill, with all but one reportedly suffering from brain tumors. Dr. Sweet was interested in learning how the distribution of uranium affected the body and whether it could be used to treat tumors. In 1995, under testimony, Dr. Sweet claimed he had the consent from his patients for his experiments. However, a lack of supporting documents, as well as the case of one patient who was found unconscious and later died without regaining consciousness or being identified, makes those claims slightly dubious. University of California experiments on newborns. Leading up to a study published in the medical journal Pediatrics, 113 newborn babies, no older than 3 days old, were experimented on by scientists at the University of California's Department of Pediatrics in the early 1960s. Studies conducted on the babies included a battery of bizarre and seemingly unnecessary experiments regarding blood flow and pressure. In one test, over 40 babies were placed on circumcision boards and held upside down while doctors measured how their blood flowed to their head. In another, babies were placed ankle-deep in ice-cold water while a catheter was inserted into their aorta in an effort to monitor their aortic pressure. Guatemala Syphilis Study.
Even though the experiments were conducted more than 60 years ago, there are families still suffering the consequences.
The United States has a sordid history of running scientific tests on their own citizens, but that certainly hasn't stopped them from exploiting people in other countries. In the 1940s, John Charles Cutler, the same doctor behind the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, inflicted over 1,000 Guatemalans with various venereal diseases.
No one gave their consent, and they were certainly not informed that they were being infected with syphilis and gonorrhea.
The unknowing subjects ranged from soldiers to orphans, and of the many afflicted, only 700 received treatment. This left the majority to suffer, with 83 people even dying.
Cuando usted se casó, ¿le pegó esa enfermedad a su esposa?
Más o menos, sí.
Despite the large amount of data they gathered, the findings were never published, making the victims' pain all for nothing. In 2010, the U.S. government formally apologized to Guatemala, but the victims and their families have received no compensation for their experience. The Monster Study. Even the most seemingly simple tests can have lifelong consequences. In 1939, scientists from the University of Iowa conducted a trial to study the effects of stuttering on children.
He developed the Monster Study to see if stuttering was not the result of biology, but of learned behavior.
They sourced their subjects from orphanages, many of whom were unaware they were taking part in a study. Some already had a stutter, while others didn't. During the experiments, half of the subjects were praised for their speech pattern, while the rest were heavily derided.
They were told things like, "You must try to stop yourself immediately. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right."
Several of the children displayed negative psychological effects, including refusal to speak and becoming extremely self-conscious.
Reports show that these children became withdrawn and some stopped speaking altogether. These children were as young as 5 years old.
The results of the Monster Study were never published, and it only came to light in 2001 after a reporter stumbled upon the papers. The surviving subjects were finally compensated in 2007. The Stanford Prison Experiment.
The study shows what happens when you put good people in a bad place.
Designed by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the goal of this 1971 experiment was to examine the psychological impact of imprisonment. For the experiment, the psychology building at Stanford University was turned into a prison, with 24 undergraduate students divided into two groups, prisoners and guards. They took their commitment to the roles to disturbing levels, with the guards doling out severe mistreatment and the prisoners accepting it.
I shouted in their faces, "I'm going to hit you so hard, it's going to kill your whole family."
Things got so intense that some students had to be removed due to the trauma. Although the exercise was supposed to last 2 weeks and had the interest of the U.S. Marine Corps and Navy, it was shut down after just 6 days when the repercussions of the experiment became clear.
It's made me feel terrible my whole life.
The Milgram Experiment. Fascinated by what motivated Nazi officers to commit atrocities during World War II, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment to see how far Americans would go before their conscience intervened.
120 volts.
In the 1960s study, a teacher would read questions to a learner, who was actually an actor pretending to participate. For every wrong answer, the teacher gave what they believed was a real electric shock, gradually increasing to 450 volts.
150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here.
If the teachers objected, they were forced to administer it regardless. After being assured they would be free of responsibility, most complied, even when the learner screamed in agony. 2/3 of the 40 participants went all the way to 450 volts, proving our deep-rooted tendency to obey authority even against our own moral judgment.
Please continue.
People surprise you. Dr. Bender's electroconvulsive therapy. While working as a neuropsychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital, Dr. Loretta Bender decided an effective treatment for children with developmental disorders or schizophrenia was electroconvulsive therapy, previously called electroshock therapy.
Here we go.
In 1947, Dr. Bender sent small electric currents through the brains of 98 children, some of whom were as young as toddlers. Another of Dr. Bender's methods for trying to alleviate schizophrenia was to give her young patients LSD. Ted Chabazinski was one of the children who went through the therapy when he was 6 years old, and he later became a human rights activist who successfully fought against the use of electroshock therapy in Berkeley, California.
And you're going to find it a very liberating experience
to get involved in our movement and to fight against the people who have tried to crush you when you were a child.
Military experiments with mustard gas during World War II.
It was a painful, horrifying, and secret part of America's history during World War II.
In 1943, the Navy recruited upwards of 60,000 young men for a study. Only they weren't asked to participate, they were told. Only when they arrived at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. did they find the real purpose of the study: to measure the effects of mustard gas and other chemicals on humans.
African American men, shown here in protective gear, as well as Japanese American and Puerto Rican soldiers, were singled out.
Locked in chambers and exposed to the deadly gas, the men involved in these experiments suffered horrible health effects, including internal and external burns.
Rollins Edwards, who I interviewed in my story, he still, more than 70 years later, he still has thick scabs on his skin, which he scratches at and until they bleed.
Additionally, as it was a wartime experiment, they were bound by oaths of secrecy and faced dishonorable discharge or imprisonment if they spoke of the order, the details of which were not formally declassified until 1993. Unit 731.
Unit 731 compound is one of the most terrifying secrets in the 20th century.
World War II was a hotbed for horrific human experimentation. Several countries took place in ghastly research, with victims still being affected by the testing today. Unit 731 in Japan was one of the worst. They were unrelenting, performing vivisections and testing out violent weaponry like grenades and flamethrowers on prisoners of war.
The atmosphere here is still heavy with the terror and the torture of that time.
They also utilized biological warfare, knowingly giving people frostbite and using animals to spread various harmful pathogens. Over 14,000 people were murdered directly, while an estimated 300,000 died as a result of disease. Even after the torture chamber was shut down, most of the main perpetrators faced only light sentences, and the government has yet to admit to the true extent of the war crimes committed.
Now claims have surfaced that Unit 731 not only tested on POWs, but also on thousands of Chinese civilians.
Vanderbilt University's vitamin drinks. Following World War II, researchers at Vanderbilt University gave over 800 pregnant women a mysterious concoction they were told was a special vitamin drink. It was actually a mixture that contained doses of radioactive iron, as the scientists were testing its absorption rate during pregnancy. The radiation these women were exposed to was reportedly 30 times higher than normal. Around 3 to 4 children died of cancer or leukemia as a result of the experiment, and some mothers developed rashes, lost hair and teeth, and contracted various types of cancer themselves. In 1994, almost 40 years later, Vanderbilt University faced a lawsuit for the 4-year study and was forced to pay out more than $10 million in damages. Josef Mengele's twin study.
Known as the Angel of Death. He wanted to improve the stock of the Aryan race.
Japan wasn't the only country committing scientific atrocities during the Second World War. The horrors carried out by Josef Mengele can only be described as evil, with some of his most twisted being conducted on twins.
Mengele came around and asked for twins. My mother first didn't know what to say. Second time, no. Third time, she said yes. Immediately, 2 adjutants grabbed us. I never even had a chance to say goodbye.
Using one as the control and the other as the experimental group, he put them through torture disguised as scientific testing. His twisted methods included amputating healthy limbs, performing blood transfusions between siblings, and in some macabre cases, sewing people together to create conjoined twins. Many died as a result of these procedures, and those who survived were often slain to be studied afterwards. Out of the 1,500 tested, only 200 made it out alive, making Mengele's experiments among the deadliest in history.
The world's most notorious Nazi fugitive would never answer for his crimes.
The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. From 1932 to 1972, 600 African-American farmers from Alabama were selected for a U.S. Public Health Service program, receiving many benefits for their cooperation. However, they were never informed that they were being studied. Of the group, 399 men had syphilis, while the other 201 served as a control unit. Many of these subjects, mostly poor and illiterate sharecroppers, didn't know they were infected. Even with penicillin being developed as a cure in 1947, it was withheld from the patients.
Under the false pretense of providing a special remedy, researchers performed painful and invasive spinal taps to investigate the disease's neurological consequences.
Many ultimately died of syphilis, while at least 40 women contracted it from their husbands, and nearly 20 children were born with it. The study was only stopped in 1972 after an information leak.
At the study's conclusion, only 74 of the original 600 men were still alive.
But it wasn't until 1997 when President Bill Clinton issued a formal government apology. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Project MKUltra. Officially sanctioned in 1953 and backed by the CIA, this series of experiments studied the effects of mind control, with methods like hypnosis, drugs, isolation, and sensory deprivation.
Under the direction of infamous Scottish-American psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, unsuspecting patients, many of whom had common ailments such as postpartum depression, were experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails and extreme techniques.
The CIA enlisted the help of prisons, hospitals, and over 40 universities to perform experiments on unwitting subjects. In one of the sub-projects, Operation Midnight Climax, sex workers, acting as undercover agents for the CIA, gave clients LSD, while the agency observed them through a one-way mirror. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all records related to MKUltra. However, subsequent investigations led by Senator Frank Church and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, in addition to 20,000 records recovered in 1977, helped shed light on the activities.
He never came out the same. He had a blank look in his eye. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know we were his daughters.
Which of these human-based experiments do you find the most disturbing? Let us know in the comments below.
I remember looking back and seeing her arms stretched out in despair as she was pulled away. I never got to say goodbye to her.